Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the peach orchard, illuminating the spacious hall where Chanel Jackson and Marcus Williams were to be married in 2 weeks. The delicate scent of fresh-cut flowers filled the air, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and joy. Chanel walked slowly through the room, scrutinizing every detail of the future celebration. Her dark skin contrasted beautifully with the snow-white tablecloths that covered the elegant round tables. Each table was adorned with a delicate floral arrangement of soft pink peonies and white roses. Chanel ran her fingers over the soft petals, smiling at her thoughts. She had always dreamed of the perfect wedding, and now that dream was becoming a reality. In her 28 years, Chanel was already a successful attorney at a prestigious Atlanta law firm. Her sharp mind and determination had allowed her to rise quickly up the career ladder. But today, all thoughts were centered on the upcoming gala. Marcus Williams, her fiancé, was a match for his bride. In his 30s, he was already running his own IT company specializing in innovative software solutions. Their meeting 2 years ago at a charity event seemed like destiny. From that moment on, they were inseparable, supporting each other in their careers and personal lives. Chanel walked over to the large mirror hanging on the wall of the hall. She critically examined her reflection, mentally imagining how she would look in her wedding dress. Her dark eyes shone with happiness, and a slight smile played on her lips. "This is going to be the best day of my life," she whispered, feeling her heart fill with joyous excitement. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the phone ringing. It was Tiffany, Chanel's best friend and chief bridesmaid. "Chanel, honey, how are the preparations going?" came Tiffany's excited voice. "Everything is going according to plan, Tiff," Chanel replied as she continued to look around the room. "I'm in the peach orchard right now, checking out the final details of the decorations." "Great. What about the menu? Have you and Marcus decided on it yet?" Chanel sighed. Choosing a menu was proving to be more of a challenge than she had anticipated. "We're still discussing a few things. Marcus insists on traditional Southern cuisine, and I want to add some modern dishes." "I'm sure you'll find the perfect combination," Tiffany encouraged her. "By the way, don't forget the cake. That's the most important part." The mention of cake reminded Chanel of a recent conversation with her brother. Derek, her younger brother, had suggested ordering an almond cake from a well-known pastry shop. The suggestion took Chanel by surprise. Their relationship with Derek had always been strained, and she couldn't tell if it was a sincere gesture or another attempt to interfere in her life. "Yeah, about the cake," Chanel began, but fell silent, not knowing how to explain the situation. "Is something wrong?" Tiffany asked, catching the note of concern in her friend's voice. Chanel took a deep breath. "Derek suggested we order an almond cake. I don't know what to think. You know what kind of relationship he and I have." "Maybe it's his way of connecting with you," Tiffany suggested. "Give him a chance, Chanel. After all, almond cake sounds good." Chanel thought for a moment. Perhaps her friend was right, and this really was a chance to improve her relationship with her brother. She decided to discuss it with Marcus later. After saying goodbye to Tiffany, Chanel went back to looking around the hall. She walked over to where the wedding cake was to stand, and for a moment, she envisioned a tall, elegant almond cake there. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad idea after all. Chanel's musings were interrupted by the arrival of the wedding planner, Mrs. Thompson. The energetic, middle-aged woman quickly approached Chanel, holding a clipboard with a detailed plan of the event. "Miss Jackson, I'm so glad you're here," Mrs. Thompson exclaimed. "We have a few more questions about the decor and seating of the guests." Chanel spent the next hour discussing the minute details of the wedding. They coordinated the color scheme of the napkins, chose the design of the guest name tags, and approved the location of the musicians. Each decision brought Chanel closer to her perfect day. Finished with the organizer, Chanel stepped out into the beautiful peach orchard that surrounded the mansion. A soft spring breeze played with her hair, and the scent of peach trees in bloom filled the air with sweetness. She imagined what the ceremony would look like here, against the backdrop of the blossoming garden, and her heart fluttered with excitement. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was Marcus. "Hello, love," came his deep voice. "How are things at the peach orchard?" Chanel smiled as she heard her fiancé's voice. "It's going great, darling. Mrs. Thompson and I just finished discussing the final details." "Wonderful." Listen, I've been thinking about the menu, Marcus began. Chanel tensed, expecting another argument about the food choices. I agree with you about the modern dishes, Marcus continued, surprising Chanel. I think we can make the perfect combination of traditional Southern cuisine and modern trends. Chanel felt a wave of relief and love come over her. This was why she was marrying this man. He was always willing to compromise and support her. Thank you, my love, she said, feeling tears of happiness come to her eyes. You're the best. And one more thing, Marcus added. I think we should agree to Derek's suggestion about the almond cake. It might be a good chance to bond with your brother. Chanel froze, surprised at the way Marcus had voiced her own thoughts. You really think so? Yes, sweetheart. Family is important, and if Derek is trying to step up, we have to give him that chance. Chanel felt her heart fill with love for Marcus. He always knew what to say and how to support her. Okay, let's give it a try, she agreed. I'll call Derek and tell him we accept his offer. Finished talking to Marcus, Chanel took another look around the beautiful garden. She could feel all the pieces of her perfect wedding coming together. Despite the small challenges and doubts, she was confident that this day would be the beginning of a new, beautiful chapter in her life. With a smile on her face, Chanel headed towards the exit of Peach Orchard. There was still a lot to do ahead of her, but right now she felt ready for anything. After all, she had Marcus by her side, and their love could overcome any obstacle. Dawn colored the Atlanta sky in soft peach tones, as if nature had decided to congratulate Chanel and Marcus on their special day. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains into the bride's room at the Peach Orchard, where Chanel was already awake, gripped with excitement and anticipation. She sat in front of the mirror while the makeup artist and stylist worked on her image. Chanel looked at her reflection, but her thoughts were far away. She remembered how she met Marcus, their first date, the marriage proposal. Each memory made her heart beat faster. Tiffany, her best friend and chief bridesmaid, fussed nearby, helping with the finishing touches. You look absolutely stunning, Chanel, she said admiringly as she adjusted the pleats on the bride's gorgeous white dress. Chanel smiled, feeling excitement mixed with joy. Thank you, Tiff. I can't believe this day has finally arrived. Outside the window, guests began to gather. Elegant cars pulled up to the mansion one by one, with smartly dressed people stepping out of them, holding gifts and bouquets of flowers. The air was filled with the hum of voices and laughter, creating an atmosphere of celebration and expectation. At this time, Marcus was in his room finalizing the last preparations. His best friend and best man, Jason, was helping him tie his tie. So, ready to be a married man? Jason teased. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to hide his nervousness. More ready than ever, he replied, smiling. Chanel is the best thing that's happened in my life. Meanwhile, in the garden, everything was ready for the ceremony. Rows of white chairs were neatly arranged in front of an elegant archway, decorated with flowers and ribbons. Musicians were tuning their instruments, preparing to play the wedding march. The guests took their seats, eagerly awaiting the appearance of the bride. Among them could be seen Chanel's colleagues from the law firm, employees of Marcus's IT company, friends and relatives of the newlyweds. Suddenly, the music started playing, and all heads turned toward the beginning of the aisle. Chanel, led by her father, began her walk down the aisle. Her dress rustled softly on the grass, and her eyes shone with happiness. Marcus, standing at the archway, couldn't take his eyes off her, feeling his heart fill with love. The ceremony was short but touching. Chanel and Marcus exchanged vows they had written themselves, eliciting tears of emotion from many of the guests. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, the garden filled with applause and congratulations. After the ceremony, the guests moved to the spacious banquet hall of the mansion. The tables were bursting with exquisite dishes, combining traditional Southern cuisine with modern culinary trends, just as the newlyweds wanted. An elegant wedding cake, the same almond cake that Derek had suggested, towered in the center of the room. Chanel and Marcus were glowing with happiness as they accepted congratulations from their guests. They stayed close to each other, holding hands and exchanging loving glances. It seemed like nothing could mar this perfect day. When it was time to cut the cake, Derek, Chanel's brother, approached the newlyweds with a silver goblet in hand. Chanel tensed, not knowing what to expect from her brother, with whom she'd always had an uneasy relationship. Derek cleared his throat and began to speak. "Chanel, my sister, and Marcus, my new brother, I want to congratulate you on this beautiful day." His voice sounded sincere, which surprised Chanel. "I know our relationship hasn't always been perfect, but today I want to take a step toward reconciliation." He lifted the cup higher. "This goblet is a family heirloom. Our parents drank from it at their wedding, and now I want to pass it on to you. Let it be a symbol of your love and our renewed family bond." Chanel felt tears come to her eyes. She hadn't expected such a gesture from her brother. Marcus squeezed her hand, silently supporting her. The newlyweds cut the cake to the applause of the guests. The scent of almonds filled the air as Chanel and Marcus each took a bite. The flavor was delicious, and Chanel mentally thanked her brother for the almond cake idea. Afterward, Derek ceremoniously handed them a cup. "To your love and happiness," he pronounced, raising his champagne glass. The guests seconded the toast, and the room filled with the clinking of glasses. Chanel and Marcus, smiling, took a sip from the family cup, cementing their union with this ancient ritual. The sweet scent of almonds still lingered around, masking any other odor that might have come from the drink in the goblet. The feast continued. The guests enjoyed the exquisite food and engaged in lively conversations. Chanel and Marcus seemed to be over the moon, accepting congratulations and thanks from friends and family. However, a few minutes after they drank from the cup, Chanel felt slightly dizzy. She wrote it off to excitement and fatigue, but the condition continued to worsen. Marcus, too, looked pale and lost. "Are you okay, love?" Chanel asked, feeling a growing uneasiness. Marcus shook his head. "I don't know. Something doesn't feel right," he muttered. Suddenly, Chanel felt a sharp pain in her stomach. She cried out and bent in half. Marcus tried to support her, but he staggered and fell to his knees. The guests watched in horror as the newlyweds squirmed in pain. Tiffany was the first to regain her senses and rushed to her friend. "Chanel! What happened?" she shouted, trying to help. Panic gripped the hall. Someone called an ambulance. Others tried to help Chanel and Marcus. Derek stood off to the side, his face white as chalk. The paramedics who arrived quickly assessed the situation and began administering first aid. But despite their best efforts, the newlyweds' condition continued to deteriorate at an alarming rate. Chanel could feel the life leaving her body. She looked at Marcus lying next to her. Their eyes met one last time, full of love and incomprehension of what was happening. "I love you," Chanel whispered with her last strength. "And I love you," Marcus replied before his eyes closed forever. Emergency room doctors fought for the newlyweds' lives until the last minute, but it was too late. Just minutes after they drank from the family cup, Chanel Jackson and Marcus Williams were pronounced dead. The hall was filled with sobs and screams of horror. The parents of the newlyweds were in shock, unable to believe what had happened. Tiffany sobbed as she hugged her friend's lifeless body. The police, called by some of the guests, arrived on the scene almost simultaneously with the ambulance. Detectives immediately began their investigation. They cordoned off the scene and began interviewing witnesses. What should have been the happiest day of Chanel and Marcus's lives turned into a tragedy. The wedding flowers wilted, the music fell silent, and dreams of a happy future were shattered. As the police continued their work, darkness fell over Peach Orchard. The stars seemed to shine dimly, as if mourning the young couple whose love had been so cruelly cut short at the very beginning of their journey together. The guests slowly dispersed, shocked and devastated. No one could believe that this beautiful day had ended in such tragedy. Unanswered questions hung in the air. How could this have happened? Who could have wanted this beautiful couple dead? And what awaited their loved ones now that their world had crumbled in an instant? Police tape fluttered in the wind, surrounding the spot where, just a few hours ago, Chanel and Marcus had exchanged vows of eternal love. Now those vows were their last words to each other, and Chanel's wedding dress had turned into a shroud. The investigation was just beginning, but it was already clear that this case would shake not only the families of the victims, but the entire city. The love story, so tragically cut short, will be a topic of conversation for many weeks, and the names of Chanel and Marcus will forever remain a symbol of love, interrupted at the very top. The morning after the peach orchard tragedy was overcast, as if nature itself was grieving for what had happened. Detectives Alicia Brown and Jamal Carter arrived on the scene when the first rays of sunlight barely broke through the heavy clouds. Alicia, a 35-year-old African-American woman with a sharp mind and a penetrating eye, was known for her ability to solve the most intricate cases. Her partner, 40-year-old Jamal Carter, was known for his analytical approach and attention to detail. Together they made an unbeatable tandem that was assigned the most complex investigations. As they approached the mansion, the detectives saw police tape surrounding the property. Uniformed officers patrolled the perimeter, keeping out curious gawkers and reporters who had already begun to gather at the gate. "Looks like this is going to be a tough case," Jamal remarked as he parked the car. Alicia nodded, her dark eyes narrowed, assessing the situation. "A double murder at a wedding. I've never seen anything like this before." The detectives got out of the car and made their way to the main entrance, where they were met by a young officer. He briefly brought them up to speed with the events of the previous evening. As they entered the banquet hall, Alicia and Jamal stood still for a moment. The contrast between the festive decorations and the grim reality of what had happened was overwhelming. The flowers, ribbons, and balloons now seemed a cruel mockery of the tragedy. "Let's start with a crime scene survey," Alicia said, donning latex gloves. The detectives methodically surveyed the room, paying attention to every detail. Of particular interest was the newlyweds' table, where the unfinished family cup still stood. "Jamal, take a look at this," Alicia called out, pointing to the goblet. "Do you smell almonds?" Jamal sniffed the goblet cautiously and nodded. "Cyanide? Possibly. We need to send it off for analysis." The detectives continued their examination, gathering evidence and photographing the crime scene. They noticed an unfinished wedding cake that also exuded an almond flavor. "Interesting," Jamal muttered. "The almond cake could have masked the odor of cyanide. Clever thinking." After a thorough examination of the crime scene, the detectives began interviewing witnesses. First in line was Derek, the bride's brother, whom the police had detained for questioning. Derek sat in a small room looking haggard and confused. Alicia sat down across from him while Jamal remained standing, leaning against the wall. "Mr. Jackson," Alicia began, "tell us about last night. I'm especially interested in the moment with the family cup." Derek swallowed nervously. I just wanted to do something special for Chanel. We didn't always get along, but I wanted to mend the relationship." "And you decided to give them the family cup?" Jamal clarified. "Yes, it was an heirloom of our family. I thought it would be symbolic." Alicia watched Derek's reactions carefully. "Did you pour the drink into the goblet?" "No, there was already champagne in there. I just handed it to the newlyweds." Derek's interrogation continued for some more time, but the detectives were unable to get any specific information that would indicate his guilt. Alicia and Jamal then interviewed other key witnesses: the newlyweds' parents, bridesmaids, and best man. All were shocked by what had happened and couldn't speculate on who might have wanted Chanel and Marcus dead. Back at the police station, the detectives began to analyze the information gathered. The first lab results confirmed the presence of cyanide in the cup. "So we have confirmation of cyanide poisoning," Alicia said as she reviewed the report. "Now we need to figure out who had access to the poison and the motive for the murder." Jamal nodded, opening the victim files on the computer. "Let's look at their social connections and financial status. Maybe we'll find something interesting." The detectives immersed themselves in learning more about Chanel and Marcus's lives. They looked at their social media profiles, bank statements, and work documents. Chanel was a successful attorney, Alicia observed. Recently won a major case against a pharmaceutical company. Maybe someone held a grudge against her? Possibly, Jamal replied. And Marcus recently made a big deal with his IT company. Maybe some competitor decided to eliminate him? The more they dug, the more questions arose. Both victims had successful careers, stable financial situations, and seemed to have no apparent enemies. "What about Derek?" Alicia asked. "Is he still the prime suspect?" Jamal rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "He had access to the cup, and we know about the strained relationship with his sister. but the motive is still unclear. At that moment, a young technician from the cybercrime unit entered the office. "Detectives, we found something interesting on Mr. Williams's phone." Alicia and Jamal exchanged glances. "What exactly?" Alicia asked. The technician held out a printout of the messages to them. "We found a series of messages between Mr. Williams and an unknown number. They're of a rather intimate in nature." The detectives quickly went through the messages. They were correspondence between Marcus and some male, full of innuendo and ambiguity. "Looks like our fiancé had a secret," Jamal muttered. Alicia nodded, her brain already working on new theories. "We need to find out who this mysterious interlocutor is, and whether Chanel found out about it." The investigation was taking an unexpected turn. What had begun as a tragedy of love was now taking on new, darker details. "Let's double-check all the information about Derek," Alicia suggested. "Maybe we missed something." Jamal agreed, and they plunged back into studying the data. After a few hours of painstaking work, Jamal suddenly straightened up, his eyes lighting up. "Alicia, look," he pointed to the computer screen. "Derek works as a jeweler. You know who uses cyanide a lot?" "Jewelers," Alicia finished for him, "to clean gold and silver." This discovery added weight to the suspicions about Derek. Now, he not only had access to the goblet, but also potential access to the poison. "We should check his workshop," Alicia said, "and question him again, but with new information." The detectives worked late into the night, putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. They drew up a list of questions to re-interview Derek and prepared a search request for his jewelry shop. When they finally left the station, the moon was already high in the sky. Alicia and Jamal were tired but determined to solve the case. "Tomorrow is going to be a big day," Alicia said as she got into the car. "I feel like we're close to solving it." Jamal nodded, starting the engine. "Yeah, but something tells me this story is going to give us some more surprises." As the detectives drove through the night streets of Atlanta, their minds were occupied with the details of the case. They knew that somewhere in this city, the killer was enjoying his freedom, thinking he had committed the perfect crime. But Alicia and Jamal were determined to prove otherwise. The next morning, the detectives arrived at the peach orchard again. Now, in daylight, the crime scene looked even more surreal. The wilted flowers and abandoned jewelry were reminders of how quickly joy can be replaced by tragedy. Alicia and Jamal spent several more hours scrutinizing every corner of the mansion and the surrounding grounds. They looked for any additional clues that might have been missed in the hustle and bustle of the first day. "Jamal, take a look at this," Alicia called out, pointing to a small bush near the entrance to the mansion. Under the bush lay a crumpled piece of paper. Jamal carefully picked it up, unfolded it, and read the contents. It was a handwritten note. "We must talk. I know everything. Shh." "Interesting," Jamal muttered. "It looks like Chanel's handwriting. But who was she writing it to?" Alicia looked at the note thoughtfully. "Marcus, perhaps? If she found out about his secret correspondence." This discovery added a new twist to their investigation. Now the detectives not only had to deal with their suspicions about Derek, but also figure out exactly what Chanel knew and how it might have influenced the events of that fateful night. The morning at the Atlanta police station began with the questioning of Derek Jackson. Detectives Alicia Brown and Jamal Carter sat across from him in a small interrogation room whose air seemed to be saturated with tension. Derek looked haggard. His dark skin had taken on an unhealthy gray tint, and his eyes were red from sleep deprivation and tears. He nervously rubbed the sleeve of his shirt, avoiding the detective's direct gaze. "Mr. Jackson," Alicia began, "we'd like to ask you some additional questions about your background and your relationship with your sister and her husband." Derek nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yeah, I'll do my best to answer all of your questions." Jamal opened a file folder. "We learned that you work as a jeweler. Is that correct?" "Yes, I have a small workshop downtown." "And you use potassium cyanide in your work?" continued Jamal. Derek visibly tensed. "Yes, it's common practice in the jewelry business. We use it to refine gold and silver." Alicia watched Derek's reaction carefully. "Where do you store the cyanide? Is it under lock and key?" "Of course," Derek replied, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm always very careful with such substances." The detectives continued to question Derek about his work. trying to find out if he could have taken the cyanide out of the workshop. However, despite Derek's obvious nervousness, they could find no direct evidence of his involvement in the crime. The conversation turned to Derek's personal life. Alicia asked softly, "Mr. Jackson, we know you had a complicated relationship with your sister. Can you tell us more about that?" Derek took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping. Chanel was always the golden child in the family, beautiful, smart, successful. And me, I always felt like a failure around her. He talked about his failures in his personal life, how he was dumped by girls one after another, how he felt lonely and misunderstood. "But I loved my sister," he added with tears in his eyes. "Despite everything, I loved her." Jamal asked the next question. "What about Marcus? What was your relationship like with your sister's husband?" For a moment, Derek froze, his eyes widening. We were on good terms. He was a good guy." Alicia noticed the hiccup and decided to dig deeper. "Are you sure there wasn't some kind of special relationship?" Derek turned even paler. "Yeah, I don't know what you mean." "Mr. Jackson," Jamal leaned forward, "we found some messages on Marcus's cell phone, messages of an intimate nature sent by a male." Derek covered his face with his hands. "That was a long time ago," he whispered. "Before he started dating Chanel, we had a brief affair, but that ended a long time ago." This information came as a surprise to the detectives. They glanced over it, realizing that it could be a clue as to the motive behind the crime. After questioning Derek, Alicia and Jamal decided to check his jewelry shop. They hoped to find evidence that the cyanide had been taken from there. However, an inspection of the shop did not yield the desired results. The cyanide was stored in a safe, to which, in addition to Derek, another employee had access. It was impossible to prove that the poison was taken from there. The next step was to interview Chanel's colleagues and friends. They all spoke of her as a wonderful person and a talented lawyer. However, some mentioned an underlying conflict between Chanel and Derek. "Chanel once told me that it was like Derek was obsessed with her life," one coworker recounted. "She was afraid he might do something to hurt her career or her relationship with Marcus." This information got the detectives thinking. They began to develop a theory of motive based on Derek's jealousy and envy of his sister. Perhaps Derek couldn't handle the fact that Chanel was going to marry someone he had once had a relationship with, suggested Alicia. That could have been the last straw. Jamal nodded. And using cyanide makes sense given his profession. He knew how to use it and how to mask the odor with almond cake. However, despite the seemingly logical nature of this theory, the detectives still had their doubts. Something about this story didn't add up. "What about that note we found?" asked Jamal. "We still haven't figured out who it was addressed to or who wrote it." Alicia looked thoughtfully at the copy of the note. "Yeah, that's odd. The handwriting looks like Chanel's, but the signature is just the letter S. This could be an important piece of evidence." The detectives decided to go through all the evidence they had collected one more time, hoping to find something they might have missed. They knew the clue was somewhere close by. They just needed to put all the pieces of the puzzle together correctly. As they worked, questions swirled in their heads. Was Derek really guilty? Or were they missing something important? Who else would have a motive for killing Chanel and Marcus? The morning was overcast, as if reflecting the somber mood of detectives Alicia Brown and Jamal Carter. They were going in for the crucial interrogation of Derek Jackson, hoping to finally uncover the truth behind Chanel and Marcus's tragic deaths. Derek looked even more haggard than he had in days. His dark skin had taken on an unhealthy grayish tint, and his eyes were red and puffy. He nervously rubbed the cuffs of his shirt as the detective sat down across from him in the interview room. "Mr. Jackson," Alicia began, her voice calm but firm, "we've uncovered some new facts that we'd like to talk to you about." Derek flinched, but nodded. "I'm ready to answer your questions." Jamal opened a file folder. "You told us about your past relationship with Marcus Williams, but why didn't you do so sooner?" Derek turned even paler. "Yeah, I didn't think it mattered. It was a long time ago before he started dating Chanel." "And you're sure it's really over?" asked Alicia, watching Derek's reaction carefully. He visibly tensed up. "What do you mean?" We have reason to believe that your relationship with Marcus may have continued after his marriage to your sister, Jamal said. Derek covered his face with his hands. It didn't, he whispered. Yes, there were moments, but nothing serious. We both knew it was wrong. Alicia and Jamal looked over at each other. Mr. Jackson, Alicia continued, we also learned that you use potassium cyanide in your jewelry shop. Is that correct? Derek nodded. Yes, it is a common practice in our business, but I'm always very careful with it. Can you explain why traces of cyanide were found in the wedding cup? Asked Jamal. Yeah, I don't know, muttered Derek. I swear I didn't do anything. I loved my sister, despite our differences. The interrogation continued for several more hours. Detectives asked questions about the conflicts between Derek and Chanel, about his feelings for Marcus, about his access to cyanide. Derek answered, but his answers were often contradictory and unconvincing. After the interrogation, Alicia and Jamal discussed the information they had received. Everything points to Derek, Jamal said. Motive, access to the poison, the ability to tamper with the drink in the cup. Alicia nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes. Yes, but something doesn't add up here. Why does he deny his guilt so emphatically? And that note we found. We never found out who wrote it or who it was addressed to. They decided to talk to Chanel's friends and colleagues once more, hoping to find the missing pieces of the puzzle. The first person they met with was Tiffany, Chanel's best friend. She looked exhausted, but kept herself collected. Tiffany, Alicia began, we'd like to ask you a few additional questions. Have you ever noticed anything odd about the relationship between Chanel, Marcus, and Derek? Tiffany hesitated for a moment before answering. I'm not sure. Sometimes I thought there was some tension between Marcus and Derek, but I thought it was just because of Derek's complicated relationship with Chanel. Jamal noticed the hitch. Tiffany, if you know something, please tell us. It could be important to the investigation. Tiffany took a deep breath. I didn't want to talk about it because I wasn't sure. But I saw Marcus and Derek once. They were too close to each other. It looked intimate. This information got the detectives thinking. If Tiffany knew about the ongoing relationship between Marcus and Derek, could she do something to protect her friend? Tiffany, Alicia asked cautiously, have you ever tried to talk to Derek about it? Maybe warn him or ask him to stop? Tiffany shook her head. No, I didn't know how to bring it up. I was afraid of ruining Chanel's happiness. Jamal watched Tiffany's reaction carefully. Something about her behavior seemed odd to him, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. After talking to Tiffany, the detectives continued to interview Chanel's other friends and co-workers. They all spoke of the strained relationship between Chanel and Derek, of the brother's envy of his sister's success. Chanel once told me she was afraid Derek would do something to ruin her happiness, one of Chanel's co-workers said. She never thought he could go that far, but she always felt he was jealous of her. This information seemed to support the theory that Derek was guilty. However, Alicia and Jamal still had their doubts. We're missing something important, Alicia said, looking over the notes. Something doesn't add up in this story. Jamal nodded. Yeah, and that note is still bugging me. We need to find out who wrote it and who it was addressed to. They decided to once again carefully analyze all the evidence and witness statements. For hours, they sat in the office, poring over the information, trying to find connections they might have missed before. Suddenly, it hit Alicia. Jamal, she said, her eyes widening at the sudden insight. What if the note wasn't from Chanel? What if Sh isn't the initial letter of a first name, but a last name? Jamal wondered. You think Tiffany? But why would she write a note like that? Think about it, Alicia continued. If Tiffany knew about the ongoing relationship between Derek and Marcus, she might have been trying to protect her friend. She may have been trying to get Derek to end that relationship. This theory opened up a whole new perspective on the investigation. The detectives began to review all the evidence from this new perspective. But if Tiffany wrote that note, Jamal said, that doesn't explain how the poison ended up in the cup. She didn't have access to cyanide. Alicia wondered. What if she didn't plan the murder originally? What if she just wanted to scare Derek, make him stay away from Marcus? and something went wrong, Jamal finished. Maybe she planned to poison only Derek, but instead poisoned Chanel and Marcus. This theory seemed unbelievable, but it explained many of the inconsistencies that bothered the detectives. They decided to question Tiffany once more, but this time with a new understanding of the situation. Tiffany sat in the interview room, her hands shaking and her eyes full of tears. Alicia and Jamal exchanged glances, realizing that they were close to uncovering the truth. "Tiffany," Alicia began softly, "we found a note near the crime scene. A note signed with the letter S. It wasn't Chanel, was it? It was you." Tiffany flinched, her eyes widening with fear. "Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about," she muttered, but her voice trembled. Jamal leaned forward. "Tiffany, we know you saw Derek and Marcus together. You were trying to protect your friend, weren't you?" Those words were like breaking a dam. Tiffany burst into tears, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I didn't mean to," she shouted through her tears. "I just wanted to scare Derek to make him leave Marcus alone." Alicia put her hand on Tiffany's shoulder. "Tell us what happened." Through tears, Tiffany began her story. She talked about how she accidentally saw Derek and Marcus together and how shocked and angry she was. She talked about the note she wrote to Derek trying to get him to end his relationship with Marcus. "But he didn't stop," Tiffany whispered. "I thought if he felt bad at the wedding it would scare him, make him stay away. I didn't realize Chanel and Marcus would be drinking from the cup, too. I didn't want anyone to die." Alicia and Jamal listened, feeling the weight of the truth pressing on their shoulders. A story of love and friendship turned into a tragedy because of jealousy, fear, and a fatal mistake. Tiffany Shepard's trial became a sensation in Atlanta. The courtroom was crowded, journalists crowded at the entrance, trying to get some information. The prosecutor presented evidence: a note found at the crime scene, testimony from witnesses who saw Tiffany take an unusual interest in the wedding cup before the ceremony. The defense tried to portray Tiffany as a devoted friend whose actions were motivated by a desire to protect Chanel. When Tiffany testified, her voice shook with emotion. "I loved Chanel like a sister," she said. "I couldn't bear the thought of Derek and Marcus betraying her. I just wanted to protect her happiness." She talked about how she found out about the ongoing relationship between Derek and Marcus, how she tried to get them to end it, and how in desperation, she decided to put a small amount of poison in the goblet, thinking only Derek would drink from it. "I didn't mean to kill anyone," Tiffany sobbed. "I just wanted Derek to be scared and leave them alone." The court found Tiffany guilty of manslaughter. Given the circumstances of the case and her heartfelt confession, she was given a sentence of 15 years in prison. Reaction to the verdict was mixed. Many sympathized with Tiffany, understanding her motives but condemned her actions. Others considered the sentence too lenient for a double murder, albeit unintentional. Derek Jackson, acquitted of murder charges but exposed for his relationship with Marcus, faced condemnation from family and community. He left Atlanta shortly after the trial, unable to cope with the guilt and shame. Chanel and Marcus's funeral was held in a quiet, sad atmosphere. Friends and family gathered to honor the young couple whose lives and love were so tragically cut short. Chanel and Marcus's grief-stricken parents stuck together, finding comfort in their shared loss. Alicia and Jamal attended the funeral, feeling the weight of the truth they had uncovered. They knew that this story had changed the lives of many people forever. "Sometimes the truth doesn't bring relief," Alicia said quietly, looking at the fresh graves. Jamal nodded. "But it's our job to uncover it, no matter how bitter it is." They realized that this tragedy would stay with them forever, a reminder of how easily love and friendship can turn into jealousy and pain, and how one rash decision can ruin many lives.